An AI agent can write the perfect Slack summary and still fail the only question that matters: where did you put the credentials? In this official OpenConnector example, the request is simple. Review 43 customer messages in Slack, group the feedback, then create prioritized issues in linear. The agent returns 6 themes and 8 new issues. That is useful. But the interesting part is not the result. It is the trust boundary behind it. OpenConnector is an open-source auth and action gateway for AI agents. Instead of placing Gmail, Slack, Notion, GitHub, or linear secrets inside every agent client, you connect those accounts to one runtime. The agent receives action contracts and a gateway token. It asks the runtime to execute an allowed action. The runtime calls the provider, and the result comes back with an execution record. That distinction matters. A credential can stay out of the model's context, but the data returned by an action can still enter that context. OpenConnector reduces one dangerous form of secret exposure. It does not magically make email, files, messages, or provider responses non-sensitive. You still have to decide what an agent may request and what data it may see. The project is moving quickly. Alex Veramayenko's post says more than 800 services. The launch graphic says more than 1,400 apps. On August 23rd, the live catalog reported 1,412 providers, while the current repository generated 1,409 provider entries and 14,799 actions. Those are catalog counts, not independent proof that every action works forever. SaaS APIs drift, OAuth rules change, and generated connectors still need maintenance. What you get is one runtime with several ways in. There is an SDK, a command line interface, HTTP, and OpenAPI endpoints, plus MCP for clients that speak the Model Context Protocol. Underneath, the same provider catalog defines each action's input schema, output shape, required scopes, and executor. That is more interesting than a thin MCP wrapper because the gateway also owns connections, tokens, policy, logs, transit files, and deployment state. Now to the best question in the X replies. If the password disappears and a token takes its place, is that token narrowly scoped, or is it full account access until you revoke it? The honest answer is, it depends on which token you create and how you configure it. Persistent OpenConnector runtime tokens can have their own allowed and blocked actions. They can have separate provider proxy grants. They can also restrict access to exact stored connection IDs. So a work token can be limited to a specific connection instead of every account connected to the runtime. But there are 2 catches. First, an omitted or empty allowed connections list means unrestricted connection access. Second, the Bootstrap runtime token is not a stored policy object. It inherits the deployment's action and proxy rules, while its connection access remains unrestricted. If you paste that Bootstrap token into every agent and never configure deployment policy, you have rebuilt the broad key problem at a different layer. There is another important separation. Action rules and provider proxy rules are not the same thing. Blocking an action does not automatically block raw provider proxy access. Persistent tokens start with no proxy access, which is a good default, but operators must reason about both policy surfaces. JWT authentication is supported on the node runtime, but it is not available on Cloudflare workers in the reviewed version, and JWT claims are not mapped into action or proxy policy. The second real use case is deployment. The official walkthrough starts from the repository, installs dependencies, authenticates Wrangler, creates a D1 database and an R2 bucket, applies migrations, stores the admin and encryption secrets, then deploys the worker. The result is a web console with providers, actions, runs, access controls, and documentation behind the same runtime. That path is credible because the footage shows consequential state changes, not a slideshow. Resources are created. Migrations finish. Secrets are entered through Wrangler prompts. A deployment URL appears. The provider console loads. What it does not prove is that Cloudflare is the right production target for every team, or that every OAuth provider will behave perfectly behind your chosen origin. I also ran the documented node path locally against the reviewed repository. The runtime started on SQLite, returned a healthy status, and completed the no-auth Hacker News Top Stories action. The response contained 500 story IDs, and the server persisted a successful audit record with an execution ID. That is a narrow smoke test, not a full provider benchmark, but it confirms the basic request, execution, result, and audit path. The startup logs also reveal the operational catch immediately. In local development, admin authentication, runtime authentication, and data encryption were disabled until configured. That is convenient on loopback. It is unacceptable on a reachable server. Before exposing the console or API, set a strong admin token, create proper runtime tokens, configure the encryption key, and keep the default loopback bind unless remote access is intentional. The security model has more depth than the launch post can fit. Stored credentials, OAuth configuration, pending OAuth state, and completed idempotent responses can be encrypted. Persistent token hashes are stored instead of raw tokens. Run logs are redacted and searchable. You can allow or block action wildcards. Private network targets are denied by default through an egress guard. But the escape hatch deserves a warning. If you enable private network access, self-hosted providers can reach internal ranges and overlay networks. The documentation says to use that only on a single-tenant runtime you operate. On a shared deployment, a connection owner could reach the operator's internal network from the gateway's egress position. That is not a footnote. It changes the threat model. Database choices also change the operating burden. SQLite is the zero configuration default. PostgreSQL supports multi-instance deployment, but migrations are explicit. The server checks the schema and refuses to start when required migrations are missing. Multiple instances must share the same database, encryption key, and transit file backend. This is solid operational behavior, but someone still has to own upgrades, backups, secret rotation, storage lifecycle, and uptime. The software itself is Apache 2 licensed, so the self-hosted code is free to inspect and run. Infrastructure, databases, Cloudflare resources, provider API costs, and engineering time are not free. I did not find a verified public price that would let me compare OMAL's hosted option cleanly, so I would not put a fake monthly number on the screen. Compared with managed integration platforms, the trade-off is straightforward. Composio and Pipedream package more of the OAuth and connector operations as a service. Zapier's MCP offering gives agents access to a very large managed app ecosystem. OpenConnector's advantage is inspectability, self-hosting, and control of the gateway. Its cost is that your team becomes the gateway operator. This is not an independent benchmark declaring one winner. It is a build versus buy boundary. My verdict: OpenConnector is compelling for technical teams that need agent integrations, want the credential boundary under their control, and can own OAuth apps, policies, upgrades, storage, and incident response. The runtime token and connection grant model is real, and the multi-interface architecture is more substantial than a simple MCP adapter. Do not use it because open source sounds automatically safer. Do not expose the default local configuration. Do not hand every client an unrestricted bootstrap token. And do not assume that keeping provider secrets out of the model also keeps provider data out of the model. If you want a turnkey connector layer with someone else maintaining OAuth drift and uptime, a managed platform is probably the better choice. If you want the trust boundary to be visible, configurable, and self-hosted, OpenConnector is one of the more serious projects in this category. The gateway does not eliminate trust. It gives you a place to define it.